Let me tell you that we're going to be hearing this afternoon from Dr. Henry Heimlich, who was received his BA from Cornell University in 1941, his MD from Cornell Medical College in 1943. His career is notable for the abundance of creative, simple solutions he has provided for seemingly insurmountable health and medical problems, beginning in 1945, when he came up with an innovative treatment for the incurable infection of the eyelids, trachoma. In the 1950s, he came up with an operation to replace the esophagus that is used today to overcome esophageal birth defects. In 1964, he came up with the Heimlich chest drain valve, which has saved 50,000 people. Each valve saves a life, and 250,000 valves are in use worldwide today. In 1974, he published findings on what was to become the Heimlich Maneuver, which has saved 50,000 people in the United States from choking or drowning. And the list goes on. And I could go on with the accolades, but instead, I want to leave time to hear from the good doctor. So let me introduce his wonderful wife, who's standing here to my right. This is Jane, and she told me that her topic is, I was a 98-pound weakling. Okay, that's her topic. And some of you may be familiar with her writing. She wrote that wonderful book, Homeopathic Medicine at Home. How many of you actually got that book? And a sequel, What Your Doctor Won't Tell You. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm round of welcoming applause for our Dr. Henry and Jane Heimlich.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think I like the title. It doesn't mean a great deal. It really means that I may be the only one who's old enough to remember this cartoon character. Can you remember a skinny little guy on the beach and a big bully is throwing sand in his face? The only trouble is I know I'm the only one who's old enough to remember. The reason I know is it keeps happening. Our first day of school for our daughters, they came home and they were all excited. Mommy, Mommy, guess what? You're the oldest mother in the school. So that's what happens. No, truthfully, and I'm just going to speak personally for a few minutes, but the reason I like this title is it describes me quite accurately at age 40. I was 98 pounds, and I didn't have a shred of confidence. People thought I did, but the reason I acted sort of lively and whatever was because I was imitating my mother, Catherine Murray. And my parents, Catherine and Arthur Murray, were well-known dancers and TV personalities. So I did my best to be sparkle plenty. It was okay. I was pretty good being vivacious. That worked all right, because I figured that being vivacious was never stopping talking. But being charming was a little bit difficult. So I kept on with that role, and then suddenly it really wasn't working well. My pleaser personality wasn't working. I never questioned my own needs. I simply deferred to my parents, my editors, my doctors, and my husband too. And as a writer, I wrote what anybody wanted me to write. And I became even more dependent with a very smart husband. I had a slew of health problems, and I remember Hank would go off to do a long chest operation, and I'd say, honey, I got a little sore throat. I was, that kind of person. And I had what I called my gray days. Well, these sound a lot like mild depression. I felt removed from my own children, my friends, and worse, our marriage was showing strains. You know, I'm sure you know people who have benefited from some form of therapy, or they've been involved with a religious experience that showed them a new way. Well, I had a different path. I heard the clarion call of alternative medicine, and it turned my life around. The new chapter began the way so many things do, with a chance conversation. I was at a dinner party and somebody mentioned there's a new medical center in Cincinnati and they're doing some kooky things. Well, writers love kooky, so I went off to see what this was about, and it was kooky. They were demonstrating a form of muscle testing they call kinesiology that showed you what kind of food would benefit you, or what sort of vitamins, or even what kind of music would be helpful. You know, I felt like Alice in Wonderland with the Mad Hatter. But I started researching this subject, and remember, this is way back, 1970, before you were born, and I found out that medical centers like this were springing up like mushrooms all over the country, and they all preached the same message. Take charge of your health. You know your body better than anybody else. And there was another new element in this medicine. It gave a new role for the patient-doctor relationship. Before this, we all did whatever, we said, yes, doc, no, doc, anything you say, doc. Well, this was a new approach, and it said, as I said, you know your body better than anyone else. Oh, and there was one line I liked. Your body is a beautiful temple. Don't treat it like a motel. So, and this meant more to me than anybody, because I had consulted an endocrinologist for menstrual problems, and the trouble was I couldn't sleep. I just paced the walls of the halls of our house, and I never thought to ask a doctor, what do you put in those hormone shots? Why can't I sleep? You didn't question your doctor in those days, but I pursued the new medicine, and it got off to a roaring start in 1971, and I attended the first major holistic meeting in San Diego. Oh, it was a mixed bag of presenters. I mean, you look very conventional, my friends, compared to that meeting. Oh, it was funny. There were Tibetan healers. There was a psychic named Olga Worrell. Anybody remember her? That goes way back. And what else? There was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She sat on the edge of the stage the way Judy Garland used to, and poured out her heart, describing what her mentally ill patients had taught her. And when she was through, we stood up and clapped until our fingers tingled, and then we turned to the person next to us and gave him a hug. I was used to, greeting people with a stiff arm shake, and that hug felt good. So I was off it felt like a bobsled run. There was no turning back. Let me take a sip of water. I was captivated with homeopathy. with these remedies that had been used for over 200 years. And you know all the remedies, and the beautiful part is they haven't changed. There was arnica for injuries and strains. There was belladonna for fever. And then I needed to make people take this seriously, so I told them intellectuals like Mark Twain and Louisa May Alcott were homeopathic patients, right? And if that bit of name-dropping didn't impress my audience, I'd throw in the fact that Queen Elizabeth was a homeopathic patient. And I felt like Joan of Arc. I was leading these misguided people away from those drugstore remedies onto something that was safe and effective. And after going to a number of meetings and looking for a qualified homeopath, I found someone to do the book. But researching homeopathic medicine at home had some surprises. I felt sure that the long-time homeopaths, doctors, and patients would be thrilled to have a journalist interested in the subject. So I told them, I have a publisher who likes to put his authors on television. And I waited for the response. Dead silence. Then I said, homeopathy will soon be as well known as aspirin. Dead silence. You know, after a while, I sort of felt like a showgirl from Las Vegas addressing the daughters of the American Revolution. They seemed to think I was a little vulgar. I finally caught on that the homeopaths preferred to keep homeopathy to themselves. Well, once the book was finished, I was off on my favorite pursuit, which was uncovering new medical findings. And I learned about trans fatty acids. This was new, 20, 30 years ago. And the fact that they were used in margarine and endangering your health. And I couldn't wait to warn my friends, don't use margarine. Well, you know how unsolicited, how welcome that kind of advice is. My best friend glared at me. Are you telling me that my doctor would tell me to use margarine if it weren't good for me? My excitement over alternative medicine spilled over into my day-to-day life. I had always panicked when my children got sick, bundled them into clothes, rushed them to the hospital, to the doctor's office. Well, now I had my homeopathic medical kit with 28 little bottles to take care of everyday problems. And happily, my husband and I became a loving couple again. But when it came to alternative medicine, he still had a few hang-ups. When I told him that I had referred our son to a chiropractor, he had some back trouble. Hank growled, "What kind of training does he have?" And he looked skeptical when I gulped down my vitamins at breakfast. If you ate a decent meal, you wouldn't have to swallow those pills. But all this began to change. Over a simple happening, we were drinking tea at the kitchen table one evening, and Hank spilled some boiling water on his hand. I jumped up, tore off a aloe leaf, applied the gel to the burn. Hank looked up at me as if I were Florence Nightingale. "The pain is gone. I can't believe it. The pain is gone." I guess they don't teach stuff like aloe plants in medical school. Well, that was the beginning, and it's going on. It was my second book, What Your Doctor Won't Tell You, that turned Hank into a convert. But before long, the once conventional thoracic surgeon was consulting a chiropractor for his stiff neck, having a naturopathic physician administer acupuncture to relieve the pain of sciatica. Let's see what else you did. And most important, plunged into a treatment whose roots go back to Hippocrates. The treatment is based on the age-old concept: to treat a disease, you give a disease. There are no expensive drugs involved in this treatment. In fact, no drugs at all, which explains who is the bully throwing sand in his face. You guessed it, the drug companies. But let me turn you over to Hank to learn about these treatments firsthand. Oh, yeah.
Cincinnati's 10 o'clock news.
Well, tonight's success story, Cincinnati's Dr. Henry Heimlich.
And not just because of the famous maneuver. Many years before that, Dr. Heimlich showed that sometimes the key to success is saving lives by thinking outside the box.
Part of being creative is carrying out your original ideas and fighting those who are trying to preserve what they've had for years.
The celebrated Dr. Heimlich just celebrated his 87th birthday. But back when he was just out of med school in 1944, Hank Heimlich volunteered for some incredibly hazardous naval duty, serving behind Japanese lines in China to help care for allies like these, including one who had been assigned to protect the young doctor.
One of our Chinese soldiers was shot in the chest and brought to me. He died in my hands. This was the first patient I had who had died in my hands.
The suction equipment needed to treat a collapsed lung was too complicated and cumbersome to be used during combat.
No one had ever been saved on the battlefield when they were shot in the chest.
But deaths like that first one weighed on Dr. Heimlich for 20 years. He wrote this book about the problem, and then in 1964,
I invented the Heimlich chest drainage valve. It did away with the suction. It's put on the end of the chest tube. It allows blood and air and fluid to come out of the chest but not go in.
thanks to a simple flutter valve that, if you blow on it, makes a rude sound that immediately saves lives.
In Vietnam, every soldier carried a Heimlich chest drain valve attached to a sterile tube in an envelope in his pocket. If you were shot in the chest, you didn't need a doctor or a nurse. Your buddy could just take this apparatus, put the chest tube into the chest through the bullet hole. The valve was there, the lung would come up and stay up, and they could fly them off later. It saved thousands upon thousands of lives.
And now, about 120,000 are used every year by military and civilian doctors, even though, as with the Heimlich maneuver, the valve faced fierce opposition. Given all of the rules and regulations that we have and the threats of lawsuits, can we discourage people from being creative as a society?
You can't sit back and let people die needlessly because others are trying to preserve the old methods that really never worked or even caused death.
Another great living in Cincinnati. And if you have any suggestions for future success stories, folks who are famous or successful in some quieter way, go ahead and email me by going to Success Stories on our website, foxfinescene.com.
Thank you very much. I do have to say that I just learned when Jane was talking why she left that pot of hot water near me and I knocked it over. I know not many people know about the chest drain tube, but it is really a very big thing in my life, and one of the greatest moments in my life was when I went with a group of chest surgeons as people-to-people ambassadors to Vietnam in 1992. And when we got off the plane, their chest surgeons were there, and we were introduced. And when I was introduced, the chief chest surgeon said, "Oh, Dr. Heimlich needs no introduction. Everyone knows his name in Vietnam." And I thought it was the maneuver. And then he said the Heimlich chest drain tube was given to us by the Quakers, the American Friends Service Society, and saved tens of thousands of our people during the war. And Dr. Heimlich will live in the hearts of the Vietnamese people forever. The valve was still out there, and when a person gets a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, they used to come into the hospital, they'd be hooked up to suction with a chest tube in and couldn't move out of the bed for about 2 weeks. Now you go into the emergency room, they put the tube in with the valve on and send you home. You come back in 2 weeks and they take the tube out. So that is a very big thing in my life. Well, concerning what has become to be the Heimlich Maneuver, that came about in 1974. I was a thoracic surgeon. I read that choking to death was the 6th leading cause of accidental death, number 6. And I was interested in the subject and did the first thing that you do with research, of course, is look up what is being done and why is it failing. And I found that the American Red Cross was teaching everybody to hit the back when a person is choking, and had been doing it for decades. And yet, as I searched the medical literature going back as far as 100 years, every single article, medical study, said if a person is choking on food or something else, never hit them on the back. It drives the object tighter into the airway and causes death. So I thought, well, how can we always make it move the other way, out of the airway and out of the mouth? I took a beagle, and I want to say I didn't hurt it at all, in addition to which many dogs have been saved with the maneuver for choking on hairballs and so forth. I took an endotracheal tube with a balloon on the end, as you use for giving anesthesia or oxygen, closed off the end, put the balloon down into the larynx, and pressed on the chest, because I had the concept that as a thoracic surgeon, I knew if you could compress the lungs, you could get a good flow of air to push the object out. Nothing happened. And I realized you press on the solid chest, you're not going to be able to compress the lungs. That's when I thought, if I pushed up on the diaphragm would come up in the chest and would diminish the volume of the chest cavity, compress the lungs, and give you a flow of air. So I put my fist, where it is now usual, just above the belly button and below the rib cage, and pressed upward on the diaphragm. The tube flew out. Repeated it many times. The tube flew out. Sent someone down to the kitchen of the hospital, and they got me a piece of meat. That was pretty bad for the dog, because I remember that hospital meat wasn't very good when I was a resident. Put it in the larynx, pressed on the chest, nothing. Push up on the diaphragm, it flew out every time. I also did studies on my fellow physicians and myself with a fitted mouthpiece and a tube going down to an apparatus that measured flow and pressure. And there was very little pressure when we averaged out what the technique did on these 10 doctors. When we pressed upward on the diaphragm, we averaged 205 liters per minute flow, and I knew that would work. Wrote it up in a medical journal that was picked up by a writer in the Chicago newspaper who was syndicated in many hundreds of newspapers. Actually, the first report came in a week later from Seattle, Washington. The Washington newspaper said, essentially, we have saved a life, and told the story of how a restaurateur retired, had read the story and paid close attention to it. And a week later, this neighbor came running out saying, my wife is having a heart attack, yelling for help. And he went over, saw her face literally in the mashed potatoes, did the technique, and a piece of chicken flew out, and she was saved. And this happened all over the country. And then 2 months later, the Journal of the American Medical Association editors wrote a commentary and said it had saved so many lives in 2 months. They named it the Heimlich Maneuver. Well, I might say the Red Cross continued with their backslaps until the U.S. Public Health Service, the Surgeon General, wrote this in a declaration that was distributed. A backslap, the Surgeon General said, can drive a foreign object even deeper into the throat. Chest and abdominal thrusts, which the Red Cross started using abdominal thrust. Chest and abdominal thrust because they refer to blows to unspecified locations on the body, have resulted in cracked ribs and damaged spleens and livers, among other injuries. The best rescue technique in any choking situation, Dr. Koop, the Surgeon General, said, is the Heimlich Maneuver. The Heimlich Maneuver is safe, effective, easily mastered by the average person. It can be performed on standing or seated victims and on persons who have fallen to the floor. It can be performed on children and even on oneself. And I want to emphasize, because it isn't widely enough known, that you can save a choking person if you are the choking person by doing it on yourself. This way, leaning over the back of a chair and not falling, but pressing against the same spot. And that should become better known. Well, I saw a newspaper report. I came out with this in '74. This was in 1975. And I had not conceived of this method being used for drowning. A Dr. Victor Esch, who was the chief surgeon of the Washington, D.C. Fire Department at that time, was at Rehoboth Beach. He helped the lifeguard pull an unconscious, non-breathing man out of the water. The lifeguard did what was being taught, again by the Red Cross, CPR, mouth to mouth. Turned finally to the doctor and said, he's dead. Doctor said, can I try something? He said, you're a doctor, go ahead. He did the Heimlich Maneuver, water gushed out, repeated, water gushed out, and the man recovered. That I also put in the Journal of the American Medical Association and spread very rapidly. And it was very evident. 90% of drowning victims die because the lungs fill with water. Blowing and doing CPR, blowing into the mouth, is futile. It saved It lost about 50 to 60% of drowning victims, saving only those who were pulled out before they inhaled water. There was a study done in 1982, by the way, by a man who actually was one of the original people to describe CPR. And he was at the University of Pittsburgh. And he did a study where he filled the lungs of dogs with water, measured them out. He found that 4 Heimlich maneuvers cleared all the water out of the airway. So the method, again, subsequently, was adopted by the Red Cross. This year they decided they don't think there's water in the lungs of drowning victims, and they are just choosing CPR again. Basically, they're saying, use CPR, and when it fails, let the person die. I might say the largest life-saving organization in the country, 35,000 lifeguards from 1995 to 2001, tried using the Heimlich maneuver on drowning victims and found that they saved 97% of unconscious, non-breathing drowning victims. And they then tried doing CPR first in the same study, 6-year study. And they found that in half of them, they would have died until they did the Heimlich maneuver and got the water out of the lungs and cleared the airway. So it's very important that the public knows this. I know we say, oh, there'll always be a lifeguard there, but 1,000 kids are dying. Toddlers are falling to toilet bowls at home. The leading cause of accidental death under age 5 is drowning. They also fall into bathtubs and pails of water. So everybody, just as they learn the maneuver, it would have been no use. The thing that made the maneuver work in choking is that everybody got to know it as it succeeded, because you don't know who's going to be next and whose kid or grandkid is going to be the next drowning victim. Well, last night, on the way to the restaurant we all went to, I spoke to Linda, who has a fine French name, which I can't remember, but she's one of you. And she told me about your interest, this organization's interest in asthma victims. Victims of asthma. Every year in this country, 5,500 asthmatics die during an attack, and more than half of them are children. And she described just what I knew and know about asthma. I was giving a talk to a lay audience in Washington, D.C. In the question period, a woman stood up and she said, my sister is 61. She was having a deadly asthma attack. She has horrible asthma. I knew she was going to die, and I didn't know any first aid except the Heimlich maneuver. I did it, and the asthma attack stopped. I politely smiled and took it as personally, but it kept hitting me. And I went through the NIH description of an asthma attack, which you all know. Due to allergy or foul air, the small bronchi, the small breathing tubes constrict. Every asthmatic has an inflamed lining to their lungs and airway, so they have thick mucus. So they breathe in, and they try to breathe out, and the mucus obstructs the narrow airway. They breathe in again, can't breathe out. Breathe in again, can't breathe out. Their lungs are distended, they can't breathe in or out or inhale their medicine, and they die on the spot. You probably all read a couple of years ago about a young football player in Northwestern University on the practice field. He got a severe asthma attack. He took out his inhaler
and just couldn't use it and dropped it, and he fell dead in front of everybody. There is no question. You compress the lungs by pushing up on the diaphragm, you expel the trapped air, and with it the mucus plugs. If you think an asthmatic is dying, do the Heimlich maneuver. That's the only thing you can do. You know, when he gets to the emergency room and they put a tube in the airway and try to give an injection, that's where most of them die, is in the emergency room. The maneuver can't save them. But let's take it a step further. A study was completed a short while ago on asthmatics, young 6 to 16. Prophylactically, they did Heimlich maneuvers. Now, they did it without, you don't have to do it very hard because there's no solid object. You're just getting the mucus out. And you can teach them to do it to themselves, and when it's done, have them breathe out. They did once a week. They did 3 Heimlich maneuvers on one day to get rid of the mucus. The study at the end of a year had showed that they had a better qualified, more highly qualified life, that they required less medication, that they had fewer attacks. I think this is a type of naturopathy. Seriously. If you're dealing with asthmatic patients, and with their permission, try doing a weekly, once a week, 3 easy Heimlich maneuvers where they breathe out, and then see what happens over a period of time. Well, I had another idea that came up, and my friends, who are usually there to attack me, some of them, I use the saying of Metternich, the French politician, and he said, at every crossway on the road to the future, each progressive spirit is opposed by 1,000 men assigned to guard the past. And that is the story of anything new, and I can learn to accept that as a philosophy, except that people are dying and children are dying during the delay. Well, Heimlich came up with the idea of giving HIV, AIDS patients, malaria, which sounds as ridiculous as you can get. Billions of dollars, you know this and I know it, have been spent on drugs to treat HIV, to treat AIDS, billions of dollars. Yet no virus has ever been cured with a drug, not even a cold. There were some benefits, but they were temporary, and they are diminishing. As a matter of fact, what has happened now is that the AIDS patients have viruses that are resistant. The virus hides in the brain and in certain glands and becomes resistant to the drugs. And that is the virus that is now spreading around the world, a virus that is resistant to the drugs. I remembered there was a pandemic many years ago, neurosyphilis, syphilis of the brain. Syphilis of the brain occurred, as AIDS does, about 8 or 10 years after getting infected. Then when it hit the brain, they died within 1 to 4 years, usually in mental hospitals in this country, but all over the world. they knew that if a person got a neurosyphilis patient, got malaria, got a febrile disease, they were cured frequently. So they tried to inject bacteria, but the body resisted it. This pandemic was through the whole 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. A doctor in Vienna, Dr. Wagner Jahrig, conceived of giving malaria, a curable form of malaria. 90% of the malaria in our hemisphere is vivax. It's 100% curable still, even with quinine. He injected the malaria, let it run for 3 weeks, 10 or 12 fevers, then cured the malaria, and the neurosyphilis was cured. It was spread throughout the world. In this country, our U.S. Public Health Service provided blood, malaria blood that was tested as for a transfusion, to hospitals throughout the country, as did one of the hospitals in the country, but mainly the U.S. Public Health Service. And they would inject about 10 milliliters of malaria blood, let it run in the patient for 3 weeks, cure the malaria, and the patient was cured of neurosyphilis. It emptied out the hospitals, totally emptied out the hospitals. They thought it was the fever that was doing the trick. And it was continued until 1975. At that point, penicillin, which could not cure neurosyphilis, had cured the early syphilis, and more neurosyphilis cases did not occur. Dr. von Jahrig got the Nobel Prize for malaria therapy. I began hearing things that showed that early malaria boosts the immune system. There were scientific papers showing that interleukins and interferons, and particularly interleukin 2, which is known to boost the CD4 cells as well, are products in a person who has AIDS. As you know, the CD4 cells in AIDS normally are here. Over a period of years, the virus drives them down to here. Then the secondary infection comes in and kills the patient. I found a study showing that malaria patients had increased CD4 cells. I found a study that was done in Venezuela, the Philippines, and Indonesia by 3 independent groups, not knowing of the other's work. One was the University of Nebraska, and the other 2 were U.S. Navy medical research groups. They found that in those 3 countries, in malaria areas, there was no AIDS. But when they tested the blood, they found antibodies to AIDS, showing they had been infected. When they got outside of the malaria area, they found AIDS. That was one piece of information. And a remarkable study done by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, done in the Congo, in a hospital in Kinshasa, in the Congo. They studied 112 children who had advanced AIDS. 41 of them also had malaria. At the end of the study, which was up to 2 years that they studied it, those who had AIDS alone, 35% were dead. Those who had AIDS and malaria, there was no death, and they had cured the malaria. And this was presented in 1990 at the International AIDS Conference in Florence, Italy, by the Centers for Disease Control. They also continued the study. They studied 587 children who had AIDS and/or malaria, some without either. And they reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, they reported that there was no adverse reaction between the HIV virus and malaria, indicating that it was safe to use the products. I did finally a study, I did it in China, and we ended up with 8 patients who had AIDS, advanced AIDS, and we gave them 3 weeks of malaria. The CD4 cells went up to high levels of normal in all of them. The CD4s, again, are the cells that are killed by the AIDS virus. They went up to high normal levels, and we followed them for 2 years. Followed them for 2 years, and they stayed at those high normal levels. More recently, a study was done by others, but I was in touch with them in a city in Africa. Many of the African tribal peoples are against putting or taking blood, so they let them be exposed. And by the way, in the original studies, some of them were treated that way in this country, exposed to infected mosquitoes to get Vivax. They were able to do, the studies we did in China, we were only able to do the CD4 levels at that time. With these cases, they sent the bloods to laboratories in Germany and in the United States. And they found that the blood of these patients, most of them, there was no virus detectable. Now, we don't have long enough follow-ups, but we can at least say that this has been accomplished. And we should be giving more thought to boosting the immune system instead of giving drugs. We're in a position where I think we will be able to do it in large numbers several months from now. I might say that there were those out there who, again, took a shot at me, but there was nothing wrong with the science, nothing that could harm the science, so they said, I use this experiment on poor, helpless Chinese. They didn't know that I had been in China for a year during the war and had treated hundreds and hundreds of Chinese people. And in 1984, Jane and I were invited to China because they never forget you, the Chinese. They found us, and they gave us a dinner in the Great Hall of the People. 2 days after President Reagan had a dinner there. And that's when I started doing research there, and the Minister of Health of China helped us establish this with the Public Health Service people in China. Well, I want to say that we're most anxious to see this go on, and I'm sure at this date is the only possible treatment that could be successful against AIDS. I'd like to close off on something a little simpler. but of interest that I'm pleased with. I had invented an operation for replacing the esophagus, making a tube out of the greater curvature of the stomach. And so, as that became popular, a lot of my work is done with swallowing problems. And I had a little boy sent from Morocco. He was 14, and he was 8. He had swallowed lye. It was a custom in this country as well as elsewhere to put lye into Coca-Cola bottles. The kids would get it and drink it. Destroyed his esophagus and his trachea, a permanent tracheostomy, just open here. I did the operation, replaced the esophagus, and it came out perfectly, except he couldn't swallow. I said to a nurse, and she turned out to be an obstetrical nurse, told her about this, and she said, you know, sucking is the first step in swallowing. And if we have a premature baby who cannot suck, we suck his finger, put a finger in his mouth, and that's how they begin sucking, and very shortly after is swallowing. Well, I ran down to this kid, and everyone thought I was crazy. I started sucking his finger, shoved his finger in his mouth, and within 3 days, he was eating everything. And then I got a concept of the people who have strokes. Many of the people who have strokes, as you know, have to be fed by tube. And I realized that half of the body is paralyzed with a stroke and half is normal. So I thought, if half of the muscles of your arm were paralyzed, you would exercise the good muscles to strengthen it, to strengthen the arm motions. I therefore got, over a course of period, treated 10 stroke victims who couldn't swallow and had been fed by tube for as long as 6 years. And I had them sucking their finger, and this was quite a thing in the hospital, sitting in a wheelchair sucking his finger, these old people, and also putting the finger on their Adam's apple, their larynx, and when they swallow, and if you do that, it goes up and down. So we exercised the good muscles of the mouth and the throat. Within a week, they were all eating a regular diet. Now, that has gotten around some, but I think it should be better known elsewhere. I've always admired this organization and the people in it, and I want to thank you for letting me come again to speak to you. Thanks very much. Can we take some questions? Shut me off when I'm ready. Are there any questions? Yes. And by the way, I have hearing aids, so I'll need all.
Describe again where you had them.
Oh, for choking. You suck your finger, that strengthens the good muscles of the mouth. You put your finger on your Adam's apple, swallow. It rides up and down. You're exercising the muscles of your throat.
But if they can't swallow, you still have them try and do it. If they can't swallow...
Oh, well, you still can teach them that way. Yes, they can learn to move it that way. Other questions? Yes.
Dr. Heimlich, that first replacement esophagus, was that young man kept alive with olive oil rubs?
Was he what?
That first esophageal replacement.
Yeah.
How had he been kept alive prior to your...
He had a tube in his stomach, a gastrostomy tube, and then he breathed totally. Oh, the other interesting thing there, by the way, he wasn't the first patient by any means. He came in sometime after I had first come out with it. But because his larynx was destroyed, he couldn't speak. We got a speech therapist in who taught him to swallow air, as you know is done, belched it up, and he was able to speak thereafter. Yeah. Yes?
Do people who've had malaria have increased immunity generally then?
That's a good question. Do people who have malaria have, I can't say absolutely yes or no, but I was visited by some doctors from different countries in Africa, and there were a couple from South Africa, and they went home. They were doctors from mining corporations. They went home, and they did a study. They knew many of their workers had AIDS, and they did a study on them when they came back. They were off for a few months during the summer period, always. Those that came back and had picked up malaria at home had an increased, much higher CD4s than those who did not get malaria. I would have to say that I can conceive of the possibility of it being used for other diseases. There was a study reported by the military, I think it was in Thailand, where they had another kind of febrile disease, and that also had a positive effect on the AIDS patients. Now, the others who saw this, who had seen it, who hadn't heard of malaria therapy having the previous history, never thought, well, this could conceivably be something as a treatment, you see. Actually, when I was at Cornell Med in New York Hospital, this is back in, I got out in 43, they were running 50 neurosyphilis patients getting malaria therapy constantly. That's how widespread the treatment was. Any other questions? Yes.
It's still not clear to me, is it for the malaria, is it the intermittent fevers that are causing this rise in the CD4, or is it something in the malaria bug itself?
Good question. Originally they thought, and through the entire course, they thought that it was the fever. Much of the information I've gotten was from a 1984 review, history from the Harvard School of Public Health of malaria therapy and its treatment of neurosyphilis. And they reported that some patients didn't get an increase in fever but had the malaria in their blood, and they were equally helped. So it's really, they also tried fever machines, which had little effect. I would like to read what this Harvard School of Public Health concluded. It is not hard to imagine the almost certain fate of the thousands of neurosyphilitics who would have sickened horribly and died but for malaria therapy. Are there other questions? Someone here? Yes.
So they gave them malaria and then did not treat them?
What, pardon?
They treated them for malaria 3 weeks after.
Oh, okay. So they had malaria for 3 weeks before they were treated?
Yes, you let it run about 3 weeks. That's 10 to 12 fevers. And I don't know how they decided on that. But again, the man who got the Nobel was the one who did it. They found that black Africans in Africa were frequently resistant to Vivax So they used falciparum, which is somewhat more dangerous and a little harder to cure, but it did cure the neurosyphilis. And there was never a series showing that they couldn't cure the malaria in these cases. Yes?
I've heard that fever therapy for syphilis was successful, but it had to be so high that the patient, it was like, are they going to live or die from the, from the fever that you're inducing? With fever machines.
That the fever was, you could always control the fever if you wanted to bring it down.
Yeah, but you had to get it to the point where maybe the patient was going to die before it was successful.
Oh, no, these neurosyphilis patients were in condition that were treated. Yeah, there was no trouble.